The rain fell in sheets as we stood around my mother-in-law Margaret's casket. I gripped my umbrella tightly, watching water cascade off the edges and splash onto my black heels. Beside me, my husband David stared straight ahead, his face a mask of grief that hadn't shifted in the 3 days since his mother had passed. "She loved the rain," he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it beneath the patter on my umbrella. "Said it washed everything clean." I squeezed his hand but said nothing. What could I say? That the cancer that took her had been swift and merciless? That at least she hadn't suffered long? All the platitudes felt hollow, especially standing. Here in the cemetery where we were about to lower her into the ground. Behind us stood Harold, my father-in-law, looking surprisingly composed for a man who'd just lost his wife of 42 years. Their marriage had always seemed like something from another era, unwavering, unquestioning devotion. Or at least that's what I thought. "Eleanor." Harold's voice startled me as he touched my elbow after the service. "Would you drive me home?" I don't think I should be behind the wheel." I nodded, surprised. Harold had never asked me for anything in the 5 years since I'd married David. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant. He was old school, a retired bank manager who still wore a tie to Sunday dinner and called me young lady despite my 35 years. David was busy talking with his sister Charlotte, who had flown in from Seattle with her husband and kids. "I'll tell David," I began. "No," Harold cut me off. "Let him be with Charlotte. You can drive me home now, and he can join us later." Something in his tone made me agree without further question. I told David I was taking his father home, and he nodded absently, his arm around his sister's shoulders as they shared memories of their mother. The drive to Harold and Margaret's Victorian home was silent, except for the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers pushing away the relentless rain. Harold stared out the passenger window, his reflection in the glass showing a man I didn't recognize, vulnerable, uncertain. "Margaret kept everything so orderly," he said as I pulled into their driveway. The house loomed gray and imposing against the stormy sky. "She knew where everything belonged," I murmured agreement, remembering Margaret's immaculate home, her labeled spice jars, her color-coded filing system. Even as the cancer progressed, she'd insisted on maintaining order, directing us from her sickbed about proper dusting techniques and how to fold the linens. Harold unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I hesitated on the porch, not wanting to intrude on his grief. "Please come in, Eleanor," he said. "There's something I need to show you." I followed him through the foyer into his study, a room I'd rarely entered. Dark wood bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the space. It smelled of leather-bound books and the pipe tobacco Harold had given up years ago at Margaret's insistence. "Sit down." He gestured to a leather chair across from the desk. He lowered himself into his own chair with the careful movements of a man suddenly aware of his age. "I've been waiting 40 years to have this conversation, and I always thought it would be with David, but now I think it needs to be with you first." My pulse quickened. "Harold, maybe we should wait for David." "No." His hand, liver-spotted but steady, came down firmly on the desk. "Margaret made me swear to take this to my grave, but now that she's gone." He opened a drawer and removed a small key. "There are things David needs to know. Things about his inheritance, about Margaret's family. Things that will change how he sees everything." He unlocked a small cabinet behind the desk and withdrew a worn leather portfolio. "Eleanor, what I'm about to tell you. Margaret was never meant to inherit the Berkeley estate. It should have gone to her sister." I stared at him, confused. "Her sister?" "David never mentioned his mother having a sister." Harold's laugh was bitter. "No, he wouldn't have, because according to Margaret, Judith never existed." He placed the portfolio on the desk between us and slowly opened it. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, old photographs, and legal documents. 42 years I've kept Margaret's secret, he said, pushing a photograph toward me. It showed two young women, arms linked, standing before a magnificent estate home. One was unmistakably a younger Margaret. The other— Margaret wasn't born into wealth like she always claimed, Harold continued, his voice dropping as if someone might overhear. And the Berkeley fortune that paid for David's education, for this house, for everything we've had, it never should have been hers. I leaned forward, studying the photograph. The resemblance between the women was striking, both with the same high cheekbones and elegant posture that David had inherited. "What happened to Judith?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Harold's eyes met mine, and I saw something I'd never witnessed in my steady, proper father-in-law: fear. "That's what I need to tell you before David arrives," he said. "Because once he learns the truth, he'll never look at his mother the same way again. And I need you to help him understand why I kept silent all these years." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. I glanced at the clock on the wall, knowing David would be arriving soon, unaware that his family history was about to unravel before his eyes. "Tell me everything," I said, settling deeper into the chair. Harold nodded and began to speak, his words bringing to life a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a fortune built on lies. With each revelation, I understood why Margaret had taken this secret to her grave, and why Harold could no longer bear its weight alone. "I met Margaret and Judith in the summer of 1975, Harold began, running his finger along the edge of the photograph. "I was fresh out of business school, working as a junior accountant at the Berkeley Corporation. Their father, Richard Berkeley, had built the company from nothing. Real estate mostly, but also shipping, insurance. He had a golden touch." Harold poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from a crystal decanter on his desk. He didn't offer me any, and I didn't ask. I'd never seen him drink outside of holiday toasts. Judith was the older sister by 3 years. She was the heir apparent, intelligent, educated at Radcliffe, being groomed to take over the company. His voice softened. And she was kind. The sort of person who remembered everyone's name, from the gardener to the CEO. "And Margaret?" I prompted when he fell silent. A complicated expression crossed his face. Beautiful, charming when she wanted to be, but she lived in Judith's shadow and she resented it bitterly. He sipped his whiskey. Richard had decided early on that Judith had the temperament for business, while Margaret was better suited for social pursuits. I thought about my mother-in-law, always impeccably dressed, her charity galas meticulously planned, her social calendar filled months in advance. She'd cultivated the image of an heiress with noblesse oblige. Richard Berkeley died unexpectedly in the fall of 1978. Heart attack on the golf course. Harold slid another document toward me, an obituary from the Boston Globe. His will was clear. The company and the bulk of the estate would go to Judith. Margaret would receive a generous trust fund and the summer house in Newport. "But that's not what happened," I said, thinking of the Berkeley Corporation letterhead I'd seen on David's college tuition statements, the family fortune that had funded his startup. "No." Harold's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. 3 weeks after her father's death, Judith disappeared. A chill ran through me despite the stuffiness of the study. Disappeared? They found her car abandoned near Gloucester. Her purse, her identification, everything was still inside. The driver's door was open. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he extracted more newspaper clippings. The police investigation suggested she'd committed suicide by walking into the ocean. Her body was never found. I scanned the headlines. Berkeley heiress missing. Search for Judith Berkeley called off. Family mourns presumed death. With Judith presumed dead, everything went to Margaret as the sole surviving heir. Harold's eyes, when they met mine, held a haunted look. And 3 months later, she married me. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. Harold, are you suggesting— I didn't know. He cut me off sharply. Not at first. Margaret was devastated by her sister's disappearance, or so I thought. Thunder rumbled outside, and the lights flickered momentarily. I found myself holding my breath. It was about a year into our marriage when I first became suspicious, Harold continued. I found financial documents in Margaret's desk, payments to someone named Michael Lawson, large sums wired to an account in Montreal. Who was Michael Lawson? Judith's ex-fiancé. They'd broken up 6 months before her disappearance. At least, that's what Margaret had told everyone. Harold opened the portfolio wider, revealing more documents. When I confronted Margaret about the payments, she broke down. She said Judith hadn't committed suicide. She'd run away with Michael to start a new life, and Margaret was helping support them in exchange for Judith staying away permanently. I leaned back, processing this information. So Judith gave up her inheritance, her identity, everything? For a man? Harold shook his head. That's what Margaret wanted me to believe, and for a while, I did. He pushed another document across the desk, a private investigator's report dated 1982. But things didn't add up. The timing, the secret payments, Margaret's sudden expertise in her father's business. I hired someone to look into it. My fingers trembled as I picked up the report. What did they find? Michael Lawson died in a car accident 2 months before Judith disappeared. Harold's voice was flat. He couldn't have run away with her because he was already dead and buried. The front door opened and closed with a heavy thud. David had arrived. Harold quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them back into the portfolio. We don't have much time, he whispered urgently. Eleanor, I've lived with this knowledge for 40 years, telling myself I had no proof, that I could be wrong. But last week, as Margaret was dying, she said something in her morphine haze that confirmed everything. Dad? Eleanor? David's voice called from the foyer. Harold gripped my wrist. She called me Michael, Eleanor, and she begged forgiveness for what she'd done to Judith. His eyes burned into mine. My wife, the mother of my children, the woman I've loved for 4 decades. I believe she murdered her sister for the inheritance. There you are, David said, appearing in the doorway, his face still drawn with grief. What are you two talking about so seriously? I looked from Harold's pleading eyes to David's questioning ones, suddenly understanding why Harold had chosen to tell me first. He needed an ally in this devastating revelation, someone who could help cushion the blow to his son. Your father was just sharing some old family photos, I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. From before you were born. Harold gave me a nearly imperceptible nod of gratitude. Just reminiscing, he added, sliding the portfolio into a drawer. Eleanor's been very kind to indulge an old man's memories. David came to stand behind his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. Mom kept all the albums so organized. We should go through them together sometime. Yes, Harold agreed, his composure remarkable given what he'd just revealed. But not today. I think I need to rest now. As David helped his father upstairs, I remained in the study, my mind reeling. The elegant, proper Margaret Berkeley, a murderer? And if it were true, what would it mean for David and Charlotte, whose lives had been built on an inheritance of blood money? I glanced at the locked drawer hiding the portfolio. Harold had shared his suspicions with me, but he hadn't shown me proof of murder, only circumstances that pointed to Margaret's deception. Before I involved David in this nightmare, I needed more than suspicions. I needed truth. And somewhere in this house I suspected Margaret had hidden it. I waited until night fell and the house grew quiet. David had taken a sleeping pill, something he'd resorted to since his mother's diagnosis, and Harold had retired to the guest room, unable to face the master bedroom he'd shared with Margaret for decades. The rain had finally stopped, leaving an unsettling stillness. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across Margaret's immaculate home. I moved carefully, acutely aware of each creaking floorboard. Where would a woman like Margaret Berkeley hide her darkest secrets? Not in obvious places. She was too methodical for that. But she would keep them close, somewhere she could monitor, somewhere that gave her control. I started in her private sitting room, a space she'd rarely allowed anyone to disturb. The antique writing desk seemed promising, but a thorough search revealed nothing but correspondence with charity boards and carefully balanced checkbooks. Next, I examined the bookshelf, pulling out volumes to check behind them, tapping walls for hollow spaces. Nothing. After an hour of fruitless searching, frustration set in. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about the ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. Unlike every other item in the house, it hung slightly askew, almost imperceptibly so, but enough to catch my attention given Margaret's obsession with perfection. I carefully lifted the heavy mirror from its hook. Behind it was a small wall safe, its combination dial gleaming in the moonlight. My heart raced. Of course, Margaret would have a hidden safe. The question was, how could I open it? I tried the obvious combinations first. Her birthday, her wedding, anniversary, David's birthday. The safe remained stubbornly locked. Then I remembered something David had once mentioned, that his mother always used the date of her father's death for her passwords, calling it the day that changed everything. I rotated the dial, 10 to 17 to 78. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung open. Inside was a single red leather journal and a small jewelry box. With trembling hands, I opened the journal, recognizing Margaret's precise handwriting. The first entry was dated October 18th, 1978, the day after Richard Berkeley's death. Father is gone. Judith inherits everything tomorrow. After all my years of patience, of playing the perfect daughter, he still chose her, always her. But he underestimated me, just as everyone does. I flipped through more pages, my blood running cold as I read. October 29th, 1978. It's done. Judith believed me when I said I wanted to reconcile. Such a trusting fool. The cliffs at Gloucester were deserted at dawn. One moment she was standing there, the next. It was easier than I expected. I left her car as planned. By the time they find it, the tide will have taken her. There will be no body, only assumptions. November 1st, 1978. They're calling it suicide. Poor, unstable Judith, overcome with grief after father's death. No one questions it. I've inherited everything, just as I deserve. Harold from accounting has been so attentive since the funeral. Handsome, ambitious, easily managed. He'll make a suitable husband. In time. I felt physically ill. Harold's suspicions hadn't gone far enough. This wasn't just murder for inheritance. This was premeditated, calculated evil, recorded in Margaret's own hand. The jewelry box contained a single item, a sapphire ring I recognized from the photograph of Judith. Margaret had kept her sister's ring as a trophy. Find what you're looking for? I nearly dropped the journal as I spun around. Charlotte stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. David's sister had arrived at the funeral looking exhausted, her usual polished appearance frayed at the edges. Now she seemed oddly alert, her eyes sharp in the dim light. Charlotte. I stammered, clutching the journal to my chest. Let me guess. She cut me off, stepping into the room. Dad told you about Aunt Judith, about what Mom did. My mouth went dry. You know? Charlotte's laugh was hollow. I've known since I was 16. Found that same journal you're holding now. Mom caught me reading it. She knew you knew? I whispered, horrified. Charlotte nodded, moving closer. She Made me swear never to tell anyone, especially not David or Dad. Said it would destroy them, that what was done couldn't be undone. Her fingers traced the edge of the writing desk. She convinced me it was better to protect them from the truth. And you agreed? I couldn't keep the judgment from my voice. Don't look at me like that, Eleanor. Charlotte's expression hardened. You've only been in this family for 5 years. You have no idea what it was like growing up with her. Always watching, always evaluating. 1 minute the loving mother, the next… She shuddered. When she caught me with that journal, I saw a side of her I'd never seen before. And I knew she was capable of exactly what she'd written. I thought about Charlotte, always the perfect daughter, excelling in school, marrying well, raising children who called Margaret every Sunday without fail. I'd always admired her devotion. Now I recognized it for what it was. Survival. David deserves to know the truth, I said finally. Does he? Charlotte moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. What good would it do him now? Mom is dead. The business, the money, the house, it all still traces back to a crime. Telling him won't bring Judith back, but it will destroy his memory of our mother. But your father… Dad made his choice decades ago, Charlotte interrupted. He suspected, but never confirmed, never left, never reported her. He's as complicit as I am. She turned to face me. The question is, what are you going to do, Eleanor? I clutched the journal tighter, weighing my options. David was already devastated by his mother's death. Learning she was a murderer who had built their family's fortune on her sister's blood would shatter him completely. Yet keeping such a secret from my husband felt impossible. I need time to think, I said finally. Charlotte stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Be careful, Eleanor. Mom's secrets don't end with Judith. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. We both froze, staring at the doorway. A shadow moved across it. Someone had been listening. But when I stepped into the hall, it was empty. What? Do you mean the secrets don't end with Judith? I asked, turning back to Charlotte. She hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. A folded piece of paper. Mom left me this before she died. Read it after you've decided what to do about the journal. As she pressed the paper into my hand, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed by a heavy thud from upstairs. Dad! Charlotte gasped, already running toward the staircase. I followed, the journal and note still clutched in, my grip, dread pooling in my stomach. Something told me that tonight's revelations were only the beginning, and that Margaret Berkeley's secrets might claim another victim before the truth was fully revealed. We found Harold on the floor of the guest bedroom, surrounded by shattered glass from the water tumbler that had slipped from his hand. His breathing was shallow, his skin ashen. Dad! Charlotte knelt beside him, checking his pulse. I think it's his heart. Call an ambulance. While Charlotte performed CPR, I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice guided me through what to relay, but my mind was fracturing. Harold's revelation, Margaret's confession in the journal, Charlotte's cryptic warning, all colliding with the terror of potentially losing the one person who had started unraveling this web of secrets. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements a blur as they stabilized Harold and loaded him onto a stretcher. I ran to wake David, who emerged disoriented from his medicated sleep. What? What's happening? He mumbled, then snapped alert when he saw the paramedics. Dad? Possible heart attack, one of them informed us. We're taking him to Memorial. Family can follow. In the chaos, I'd tucked Margaret's journal and Charlotte's note into my purse without thinking. Now, as we followed the ambulance through the dark streets, I was acutely aware of their weight against my side. David drove silently, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Charlotte sat rigid in the back seat. He's going to be all right, I said, more to fill the silence than from any certainty. You don't know that, Charlotte replied, her voice hollow. And if he dies tonight, the truth dies with him. David shot her a confused look in the rearview mirror. What truth? What are you talking about? Charlotte and I exchanged glances. Nothing, she said quickly. Just, there were things Dad wanted. To tell you about Mom's will. Financial matters. It wasn't entirely a lie, but the evasion tasted sour. I turned to stare out the window, watching raindrops begin to fall again, streaking across the glass like tears. The next 3 hours in the hospital waiting room were a special kind of purgatory. David paced while Charlotte made calls to her. Husband and children back in Seattle. I sat clutching my purse, paralyzed by indecision. Should I tell David what I knew? Wait for Harold to recover? Destroy the journal and preserve the family myth? Finally, a doctor emerged. Mr. Berkeley is stabilized, she told us. It wasn't a heart attack, but a severe arrhythmia. We're running tests to determine the cause. Can we see him? David asked. He's resting now, but one visitor at a time would be fine. Briefly. David went first, while Charlotte and I remained in uncomfortable silence. After a few minutes, she spoke without, looking at me. I know what you're thinking, that I've been complicit all these years. I don't know what I think anymore, I admitted. This morning I was at a funeral. Now I'm sitting on evidence of a murder committed by my mother-in-law, who apparently has even more secrets I don't know about. Charlotte finally turned to me. You haven't read my note yet. I've been a little preoccupied with your father nearly dying. She winced. Fair enough. But you should read it before you decide what to tell David. I hesitated, then opened my purse and withdrew the folded paper, careful to leave the journal hidden. The note was written in Margaret's precise handwriting, dated just days before her death. Charlotte, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the time has come for certain arrangements. The safety deposit box at First Federal contains documents regarding David's adoption. He must never know. The legal work was impeccable, but if he were to investigate, questions would arise that could unravel everything we've built. The annual payments to Montreal must continue. I've set up a trust for this purpose that only you can access now. The recipient knows only to expect the money, not its source. Keep it that way. You've kept my secrets all these years. Keep this final one, and everything remains yours, as promised. My. Read it twice, my mind struggling to process this new revelation. David is adopted? Charlotte nodded grimly. Apparently, I had no idea until I read this. Mom never told me. But why would she? I trailed off as the implications began to sink. In these payments to Montreal, the same ones Harold mentioned, that Margaret claimed were for Judith and her fiancé. Charlotte leaned closer. But Michael Lawson was already dead. So who's really in Montreal? A chill ran through me. You don't think? I don't know what to think, Charlotte whispered. But I'm starting to wonder if Judith might still be alive. Before I could respond, David returned, looking slightly relieved. Dad's awake. He's asking for Eleanor. Charlotte shot me a warning look as I stood. Remember, we don't know everything yet. I navigated the sterile hospital corridors to Harold's room, my mind reeling. If Judith was alive, if David was adopted, if the payments were connected somehow, the possibilities were dizzying. Harold looked frail against the white hospital sheets, monitors beeping steadily beside him. His eyes, though tired, were clear. Eleanor, he said weakly, I need to know. Did you find anything after I collapsed? I approached his bedside, speaking low. Yes, Margaret's journal. She confessed to pushing Judith off a cliff at Gloucester. But Harold, there's more. He closed his eyes briefly. I knew it. All these years, I told myself I could be wrong. Harold, Charlotte found a note from Margaret saying David is adopted. and that payments to someone in Montreal need to continue. I hesitated. Is it possible that Judith is alive? His eyes snapped open, shock evident. Adopted? That's impossible. I was there when David was born. I cut the cord myself. Then why? Would Margaret— She was lying to Charlotte. Harold interrupted with surprising firmness. David is our biological son. I'm certain of it. But the payments to Montreal? Harold's expression darkened. Not for Judith. She's gone, Eleanor. I made my peace with that long ago. He gripped my wrist with surprising strength. But there's something else you need to know. The real reason I wanted to speak with you first. The door opened behind me, and David entered. The doctor says we shouldn't tire you, Dad. Harold released my wrist, his eyes pleading with mine. Later? He whispered. I nodded, stepping back to allow David closer to his father's bedside. My phone vibrated with a text from Charlotte. Meeting Waobao Hospital Financial Office about insurance. Search Dad's study. Bottom drawer of filing cabinet. Folder marked Gloucester Properties. As I slipped from the room, I glanced back at David tenderly adjusting his father's pillow, completely unaware that his family history was a carefully constructed lie. And now I had to decide whether to be the one to destroy it. The drive back to the Berkeley house was surreal. Dawn was breaking, casting long shadows across the rain-slicked streets. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and fatigue made everything seem slightly unreal. Charlotte's text had been specific. Gloucester Properties, the same location where Judith had supposedly died. Was this coincidence or another piece of the puzzle? The house was silent and empty when I arrived. I went straight to Harold's study, using the key he had left in the desk after our initial conversation. The filing cabinet was locked, but I found the key taped to the underside of the bottom drawer, a hiding place David had once mentioned his father always used. Inside the drawer labeled Properties, I found the Gloucester folder. It contained deed records for a small cottage on the coast, purchased by Harold Berkeley in 1979, just months after Judith's disappearance. The property was still active, with tax records showing payments as recent as last month. As I studied the documents, a small photograph slipped from between the pages. It showed a modest seaside cottage with blue shutters. Something about it nagged at my memory, though I was certain I'd never seen it before. Then it hit me. In Margaret's sitting room, there was a watercolor painting of a nearly identical cottage. She'd told me it was just a generic seascape when I'd admired it once. But this wasn't generic at all. This was a specific property her husband had purchased in secret, near where her sister had allegedly died. What was in that cottage? And who was really receiving those payments to Montreal? I was replacing the folder when I noticed another file. Behind it, unlabeled except for a small symbol that matched one in Margaret's journal, a circle with a line through it. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a single birth certificate, David Harold Berkeley, born to Margaret and Harold Berkeley. But beneath it was another document, an original birth certificate with the same date, but different parents. Mother, Judith Berkeley. Father, unknown. My hands went numb, the document nearly slipping from my grasp. David wasn't adopted. He was Judith's son. The implication was staggering. If Judith had been pregnant when she disappeared. The front door opened and closed. Footsteps approached the study. I barely had time to return the folders to the drawer before Charlotte appeared in the doorway. You found it? She asked without preamble. I nodded, unable to find words. And? She prompted. David isn't Margaret and Harold's son, I finally managed. He's Judith's. Charlotte's face remained eerily composed. That changes everything, doesn't it? Especially the inheritance. Something in her tone sent a warning, prickled down my spine. Charlotte had always been the good daughter, the one who did everything right. But now I wondered, How far would she go to protect what Margaret had promised would remain hers? Would remain hers? Would remain her? How long have you known? I asked Charlotte, carefully watching her expression. She moved further into the study, closing the door behind her. About David? I didn't. Not until this morning. She sank into the leather chair across from me. But I suspected something, the way Mom always treated him differently than me. Differently how? More possessively, more critically. Charlotte's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. She was always harder on him, monitoring his every move, his friends, his relationships. When he brought you home, I thought she might actually forbid the marriage. I remembered Margaret's cold assessment when David first introduced us, her pointed questions about my family background, her barely concealed disappointment when she learned my parents were ordinary middle-class people from Ohio. She was protecting her secret, I realized aloud, making sure David never got close to anyone who might help him discover the truth. And keeping him tied to the Berkeley name and fortune, Charlotte added. The fortune that should have been Judith's. She leaned forward. Did the folder say anything about the cottage? Is it still there? Harold's been maintaining it all these years, paying taxes on it. We need to go there, Charlotte said decisively. Shouldn't we wait for David? This is his mother we're talking about. His real mother. Charlotte's eyes flashed. And tell him what exactly? That the woman he just buried wasn't his mother? That his real mother might be alive somewhere? That would destroy him, Eleanor. He deserves to know the truth. The truth, Charlotte repeated bitterly. The truth is that our family is built on murder and lies. The truth is that the Berkeley fortune rightfully belongs to Judith, or David as her son. The truth is that my father has been complicit in this deception for decades. She stood abruptly. You've been in this family for 5 years. I've lived with these people my entire life. Trust me when I say that some truths are better left buried. I stood to face her. Is that what this is about? The inheritance? You're worried that if David learns he's Judith's son, he'll lay claim to everything? Something cold and calculating flickered in Charlotte's eyes, so reminiscent of Margaret, that I took an involuntary step back. Don't be naive, Eleanor. Mom's estate is worth over $40 million. The note promised it would remain mine if I kept her secrets. She knew what she was asking. And you're willing to keep David in the dark to protect your inheritance? I'm protecting all of us, she insisted. Once this unravels, nothing will be the same. Dad could go to prison as an accessory. The company could collapse under the scandal. David could lose everything. Or gain a mother he never knew he had, I countered. If Judith is alive, she's not. Charlotte's certainty sent a chill through me. How can you be so sure? Instead of answering, she pulled out her phone and showed me a text message from the hospital. Dad stabilized, taking David to get breakfast before returning to the house. Back in 30. We don't have much time, she said, pocketing her phone. I'll make you a deal. We go to the cottage together. If there's evidence Judith is alive, we'll decide together what to tell David. If not, we burn Margaret's journal and never speak of this again. It was a terrible deal, but I needed to know what was in that cottage. Fine, but I keep the journal until we decide. Charlotte nodded reluctantly. The cottage is about an hour north. We should go now, before they return. I left David a text saying Charlotte and I were picking up some food and would be back soon. It felt like just one more lie in a growing cascade of deceptions. The drive to Gloucester was tense and mostly silent. Rain had started again, heavy drops pelting the windshield as Charlotte navigated the coastal highway. I kept my purse clutched. Close, acutely aware of the journal and birth certificate copies I'd hastily made before leaving. Why would Harold keep this cottage all these years? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Charlotte kept her eyes on the road. Maybe guilt. Maybe hope that somehow Judith survived. Or maybe he knows she did, I suggested. Those payments? To Montreal? Maybe they're supporting her in hiding. Charlotte's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. If that were true, why not tell us? Why let us believe she's dead? To protect David? To protect Judith from Margaret? For 40 years? She shook her head. No one keeps a secret that long without a darker reason. The cottage stood on a windswept bluff, its blue shutters faded and peeling, wild roses growing untamed around the small porch. It looked both neglected and loved, like a memory someone couldn't bear to discard, but couldn't fully embrace either. Charlotte produced a key from her pocket. "Dad's keys," she explained when I looked surprised. "I took them from his hospital. Belongings." The lock turned with a protesting creak. Inside, the cottage was sparsely furnished but clean, as if someone regularly maintained it. A small living area with a stone fireplace opened to a kitchenette. A narrow hallway led to what I presumed was a bedroom. "It smells like someone's been here recently," I noted, catching the faint scent of lemon furniture polish. Charlotte nodded, moving toward a roll-top desk in the corner. Dad must have a caretaker. As she began searching the desk, I moved down the hallway. The bedroom was simple, a double bed with a handmade quilt, a small dresser, a bedside table with a lamp. Nothing personal, nothing that suggested who might stay here, until I opened the dresser drawer. Inside were women's clothes, practical, simple garments that looked recently worn. In the second drawer, I found a small wooden box containing a driver's license issued by the province of Quebec to an Elizabeth Jenkins. The photo showed an elderly woman with silver hair, but something about the eyes. "Charlotte," I called, my voice shaking. "I think Judith might be alive, living in Montreal." Under an assumed name. No response. "Charlotte?" I returned to the main room, the ID in my hand. The room was empty. Charlotte was gone. I rushed to the window just in time to see her car speeding away down the gravel drive, leaving me stranded at the cottage with my disturbing discovery. My phone showed no service, of course. The cottage was isolated, perched on a remote stretch of coastline. I was contemplating my next move when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the front door. Heart pounding, I pressed myself against the wall beside the bedroom door. Was it Harold's caretaker, or someone else? The door opened slowly. Footsteps, light, hesitant, moved across the wooden floor. "Hello?" called a woman's voice, soft with age but somehow familiar, though I'd never heard it before. "Is anyone here?" I stepped into the doorway, the Quebec ID still clutched in my hand. She stood in the center of the room, tall, thin, with elegant posture despite her years. Silver hair pulled back in a simple knot, high cheekbones, David's eyes. "Judith Berkeley," I whispered, her face paled. No one has called me that in 40 years. Her gaze fell to the ID in my hand, then back to my face. "Who are you?" "Eleanor Berkeley. I'm married to your son. I'm married to your son." For a long moment, Judith and I simply stared at each other. The resemblance to David was unmistakable. The same thoughtful eyes, the same elegant hands, even the slight tilt of her head as she assessed me. "My son," she finally repeated, her voice barely audible. "David is alive?" The question struck me like a physical blow. "You didn't know?" She moved to a chair, her legs seemingly unable to support her. "Harold told me my baby died at birth. That Margaret—" She pressed a hand to her mouth, unable to continue. I sank into the chair opposite her, trying to process this new revelation. "Harold told you your baby died? But he's been maintaining this cottage, making payments to Montreal all these years." "Yes," Judith confirmed, regaining some composure. "To keep me hidden, to keep me safe. He said if Margaret ever discovered I survived, she would finish what she started at the cliffs." My head was spinning. "So you know that Margaret tried to kill you?" Judith's laugh was hollow. "Tried? She pushed me over a 40-foot cliff onto rocks. I broke my back, my leg, my arm. I should have died. A fisherman found me, barely breathing. By the time I regained consciousness weeks later, Margaret had been declared Richard Berkeley's sole heir. And Harold found you? She nodded. He'd been searching hospitals, morgues. When he found me, I was still unable to walk, still using my mother's maiden name Jenkins to avoid detection. Margaret had already announced to the world that I'd committed suicide in my grief over father's death. But why didn't you come forward? Reveal the truth? With what proof? Judith asked bitterly. My word against hers? By then, she'd charmed everyone from the police to father's board of directors. And then Harold told me I'd lost the baby. Our baby. I'd been 5 months pregnant when Margaret pushed me. The child was all that mattered to me then. Your child with Michael Lawson, I said, recalling Harold's investigation. Pain flashed across Judith's face. Yes, we'd been engaged, but father disapproved. Michael was an artist, talented but poor. After he died in that car accident, I discovered I was pregnant. I told only Margaret, believing she would support me. She shook her head at her own naivety. 2 weeks later, father changed his will to leave everything to me, including guardianship provisions for my unborn child. 1 week after that, he was dead. And a week after his funeral, Margaret lured me to the cliffs. The timeline aligned perfectly with Margaret's journal entries. But something didn't make sense. If Harold told you your baby died, why would he do that? Why separate you from your son? Judith's eyes filled with tears. That's what I've asked myself every month when his payment arrives, every Christmas when he sends a brief note assuring me I'm still safe. I believe he thought he was protecting me and the child from Margaret. Or perhaps... She hesitated. Perhaps he couldn't bear the thought of raising another man's child. Harold had been in love with me before I met Michael. I chose Michael instead. When Harold found me after the accident, he offered a solution, a new identity, financial support, this cottage for periodic visits from Canada. But the price was that I stay dead to the world. I pulled out my phone, finding a recent photo of David. This is your son. Judith's hands trembled as she took the phone, her eyes drinking in the image. He has Michael's smile, she whispered. All these years. What did they tell him about his birth? That he was Margaret and Harold's biological son. He has no idea you exist. She handed the phone back, visibly struggling to contain her emotions. And now Margaret is dead. Harold had promised that when she was gone, I could come home. That's why I'm here. He called me 3 days ago, told me to come to the cottage. But he never arrived. Harold had a cardiac episode last night. He's in the hospital. I hesitated, then added, after he showed me evidence that suggested Margaret murdered you. Evidence? I opened my purse and withdrew Margaret's journal. Her confession, in her own handwriting. Judith took it with steady hands, reading silently, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she closed it carefully. 40 years, she said. 40 years of my life, my son's life, my inheritance, all stolen by my sister, while Harold... She broke off, a new realization dawning. The timing of Harold's episode. It happened right after he revealed the truth about Margaret. I nodded, uncomfortable with the implication. And Charlotte was there? Yes. She called the ambulance. Judith stood suddenly urgent. We need to get to the hospital. Now. Charlotte is Margaret's daughter in every way that matters. If she believes her inheritance is threatened... My blood ran cold as I remembered Charlotte's calculating expression, her insistence on coming to the cottage, her convenient disappearance once I'd found evidence of Judith. She stranded me here, I realized. She knew you might return. She wanted to delay me while she what? Judith asked, already moving toward the door. I don't know. but she made a point of telling me that she and Harold were alone at the house when he collapsed. And now she's gone back to the hospital where David and Harold are. Judith grabbed a set of keys from a hook by the door. My car's out back. Let's go. As we drove, I called David repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. The hospital line rang endlessly with no answer. The coastal road stretched before us, each curve seeming to take forever to navigate. Tell me about him, Judith said after several minutes of tense silence. About David. Despite everything, I smiled. He's brilliant, kind, stubborn when he believes in something. He founded a technology company that creates accessibility software for people with disabilities. Not in the family business, then? No. Margaret pushed for it, but he wanted to build something of his own. Judith nodded, pride evident in her profile. And he chose you. Against Margaret's wishes, I confirmed. She thought I wasn't good enough for a Berkeley. Meaning you weren't wealthy or connected enough to be controlled, Judith interpreted shrewdly. Margaret always saw relationships as transactions. It's why she hated Michael. He offered love without advantage. We lapsed into silence again, as I processed the enormity of what was happening. Beside me was David's mother, his real mother, believed dead for 4 decades. Ahead of us was a confrontation with Charlotte, whose motives grew more suspect with each revelation. And between us was David himself, a man whose entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies. My phone suddenly buzzed with a text from David. Where are you? Dad took turn for worse. Doctors say might not make it. Need you here. I showed it to Judith, who pressed harder on the accelerator. We might be too late, she said grimly. Too late for what? Her eyes met mine briefly. To stop history from repeating itself. We reached the hospital in record time, racing through the corridors to Harold's room. Outside his door stood a doctor in conversation with Charlotte. When she saw me, her eyes widened, then narrowed when they shifted to Judith. Well, she said with remarkable composure, this is an unexpected family reunion. The doctor looked confused. Mrs. Berkeley, is this a relative? Before Charlotte could answer, Judith stepped forward. I'm Judith Berkeley, Harold Berkeley's former sister-in-law. I need to see him immediately. I'm afraid that's not possible, the doctor replied. Mr. Berkeley is in critical condition. We've just discovered his heart medication was administered incorrectly. His system shows signs of digitalis toxicity. Digitalis toxicity? I repeated, my gaze shifting to Charlotte. You mean he was poisoned? We're investigating how this happened, the doctor said carefully. For now, only immediate family is permitted. Where's David? I demanded, addressing Charlotte directly. Getting coffee, she answered smoothly. He'll be devastated you weren't here. I told him you were just picking up food. Something in her tone sent warning signals through my brain. You told him I abandoned him during a family crisis. Charlotte's smile was thin. I may have mentioned that your absence seemed unusual. Where is my son? Judith interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made even Charlotte blink. Your son? Charlotte laughed, though I caught the nervous edge. Aunt Judith, if you really are her, you've been legally dead for 40 years. You have no son here. Charlotte. David's voice came from behind us. He stood holding 2 coffee cups, confusion written across his face. What's going on? Eleanor, where have you been? And who is this woman? I moved to his side, taking one of the coffee cups so I could hold his hand. David, there's something you need to know. About your mother. Mom's dead, he said, his grief still raw. We buried her yesterday. Not Margaret, I said gently. Your real mother. Charlotte stepped between us. Eleanor's been snooping through old family papers, finding things she doesn't understand. This Woman is claiming to be our long-dead Aunt Judith, but I have proof, I interrupted, fishing the birth certificates from my purse. David, this is your original birth certificate. And this, I gestured to Judith, who stood absolutely still, drinking in the sight of her son, is Judith Berkeley, your biological mother. David stared at the documents, then at Judith, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something like recognition. The doctors need to check on Dad, Charlotte interjected desperately. We should continue this family drama elsewhere. Yes, the doctor agreed, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Perhaps the private consultation room. No, Judith said, firmly, never taking her eyes from David. First, I need to see Harold immediately, before it's too late. Too late for what? David asked, looking between us all. Judith finally turned to face Charlotte directly. Too late to stop his daughter from following in Margaret's footsteps? Tell me, Charlotte, did you poison your father because he was finally going to tell the truth? About me? About David's real parentage? About the fortune that should have been mine? Charlotte's face drained of color. That's absurd. I love my father. I would never… The doctor's pager beeped urgently. Excuse me, he said, reading the message. Mr. Berkeley is coding. I need to… But Judith was already pushing past him into Harold's room, with me right behind her, David following in stunned confusion. Charlotte remained frozen in the hallway, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Inside, a team of nurses surrounded Harold's bed as machines blared urgent warnings. Through gaps in their efficient movements, I could see his face. Gray, slack, his eyes closed. Harold, Judith called, her voice cutting through the chaos. Harold, I'm here. And somehow, impossibly, his eyes opened. Clear the room, the doctor ordered. But Harold's hand lifted weakly, beckoning. Judy, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment. You came back. The medical team hesitated, looking to the doctor for direction. After assessing the monitors, he nodded reluctantly. 2 minutes. Then we need to stabilize him. Judith moved to Harold's bedside, taking his hand. I'm here, Harold. His eyes found David, who stood frozen in the doorway. My son, he said, then corrected himself with visible effort. Judith's son. David stepped forward, his face a battlefield of emotions. Is it true? He asked, his voice breaking. She's my mother. Margaret wasn't? Harold's eyes filled with tears. Margaret was your aunt. She took you, claimed you, after what she did to Judith. Save your strength, Judith interrupted gently. No. Harold's grip on her hand tightened. No more secrets, no more lies. His gaze shifted to me. You found the journal? The cottage? I nodded, aware of David watching this exchange with growing comprehension. I never knew, Harold continued, each word clearly costing him. About the cliff, about Judith being pregnant. Not until after Margaret told everyone you'd committed suicide. I looked for you, Judy. For months. When I found you in that hospital in Maine. You told me my baby died, Judith finished, her voice tight with decades of grief. Harold's face contorted. Margaret had already registered the birth with herself listed as the mother. Your son was 2 months old by then. She threatened. A monitor beeped insistently, and he winced in pain. Sir, we need to intervene, a nurse insisted. Charlotte, Harold gasped. Where is Charlotte? As if summoned, Charlotte appeared at the threshold, her composure visibly cracking. Dad, please don't. Did you tamper with my medication? Harold asked directly, his gaze suddenly sharp despite his failing body. The room went deadly silent. Charlotte's eyes darted to the exit, but a security guard now stood in the hallway, apparently summoned by the doctor's silent signal. I found your passport, she finally said, addressing Judith instead of answering her father. Last week, while looking for Mom's insurance papers. Canadian. Recent. I showed it to Mom on her deathbed. That's when she told me everything. About the cliff. About David. Her hands twisted together. She made me promise to protect what was mine. The inheritance, the Berkeley name. By poisoning your father? I asked incredulously. Charlotte's laugh was brittle. I didn't poison him, I just adjusted his medication. Enough to cause a scare, to keep him quiet until I could figure out what to do about her. She nodded toward Judith. I never meant for him to die. David finally found his voice. You knew my entire life was a lie, and your concern was the inheritance? You don't understand, Charlotte pleaded. Mom built everything on this secret. If it comes out that she attempted murder, stole her sister's child, lied for 40 years, the Berkeley name is ruined. The company stock will crash. Everything will be lost. Ms. Berkeley, the doctor interrupted firmly, I need to ask you to step outside with security while we stabilize your father, and I'm obligated to report what I've just heard to the authorities. Charlotte's shoulders slumped in defeat as the security guard stepped forward to escort her from the room. I was only doing what Mom taught me, she said quietly as she passed. David. Family protects the legacy, at any cost. With Charlotte gone, the medical team swarmed around Harold, forcing the rest of us to step back. Judith kept her eyes fixed on Harold's face, while David stared at Judith, studying every feature as if memorizing a language he somehow already knew. I touched David's arm gently. Let's give them space. There's more you need to know. In the, waiting area, I showed David Margaret's journal and explained everything. How Harold had discovered Judith alive. How Margaret had claimed him as her own son. How the payments to Montreal had kept Judith hidden and safe all these years. So my father, Harold, he's been protecting her? David asked, trying to make sense of it all. But why not tell me the truth once I was an adult? Why maintain the lie after all this time? I think Harold was trapped, I said carefully, by his love for you, by his fear of Margaret, by his guilt over separating you from your real mother, and perhaps by his own complicity. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Judith's that it made my heart ache. All those years, I tried to please Margaret, to meet her impossible standards. She wasn't even my mother. He looked up suddenly. And my biological father, Michael Lawson? He died before you were born. A car accident. Convenient, David said bitterly. Was that Margaret's doing too? I don't know, I admitted. The journal doesn't mention him except to say that Judith was carrying his child. David was silent for a long moment. I always felt like an imposter in that family. Like I didn't belong. Now I know why. He looked at me, vulnerability plain. On his face. Who am I, Eleanor? I took his hand, squeezing it firmly. You're the same man you were yesterday. Brilliant, compassionate, stubborn. None of that changes because of who gave birth to you. But everything else changes, he pointed, out. My mother isn't dead, she's in that room. The woman I mourned yesterday was a murderer who stole me from my real mother. My sister tried to poison my father, who isn't even my biological father, and the fortune that funded my education, my first company. He trailed off, the implications sinking in. It should have been Judith's, I finished quietly, and legally may still be hers. Before David could respond, Judith emerged from Harold's room, her face drawn but composed. He's stabilized, she told us, taking a seat beside David. The doctor thinks he'll recover, given time. And then what? David asked. Legal battles over the Berkeley fortune? Exposing the family scandal to the world? Judith studied him carefully. Is that what you think I want? Isn't it? 40 years of your life were stolen. Your inheritance? Your child. You'd have every right to reclaim what's yours. She shook her head slowly. What I want can't be reclaimed, David. The years I lost with you, watching you grow, hearing your first words, seeing you become the man you are, those are gone forever. Her voice broke slightly. I don't want the Berkeley fortune. I want to know my son. To know my son. The simple honesty of her statement seemed to hit David harder than any of the shocking revelations that had preceded it. He looked away, blinking rapidly. There's something else you should know, Judith continued. About your father, Michael. His death wasn't an accident. David's head snapped up. Margaret killed him too? No, Judith said, surprising us both. Harold did, I gasped. Harold! But he told me he investigated Michael's death, that it happened before Judith disappeared. He investigated to ensure no one else would, Judith explained, her eyes never leaving David's. Michael and I were planning to elope the weekend he died. Harold was obsessed with me, had been since college. When he learned about our plans, he tampered with Michael's car, the brake lines. Her voice was steady despite the horror of what she described. He confessed it all to me years later, after Margaret's hold on him had weakened. It's why I've stayed away, even after Margaret became ill. Not fear of her, but knowledge of what Harold was capable of. David stood abruptly. This is insane. Harold murdered my biological father, then helped Margaret steal me from you, then kept you hidden for 40 years? He paced the small waiting area. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve the whole truth, Judith said simply, and because Harold is dying. The doctor said he's stabilized, I objected. Judith's smile was sad. The digitalis poisoning was real, but it's not what's killing him. He has advanced pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. He was diagnosed 3 months ago, just after Margaret. That's why he's finally revealing everything. He has nothing left to lose. David sank back into his chair, overwhelmed. How do you know this? He told me just now. It's why he contacted me after Margaret died. He's been settling his affairs. Making amends where he can. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Berkeley is asking for all of you. We found Harold propped up slightly in bed, looking marginally better, though still frighteningly frail. The monitors had been silenced, giving the room an artificial calm. Charlotte? He asked immediately. In custody, the nurse informed us. The police have been called. Harold closed his eyes briefly. I've failed her too. She tried to kill you, I reminded him, out of loyalty to her mother, to the family name. He sighed. Everything I did for the same reason. Loyalty, love, fear, poor justifications in the end. David approached the bed cautiously. Is it true? About my father? About Michael Lawson? Harold met his gaze without flinching. Yes. It was the first step on a path I've regretted every day since. I loved Judith. When she chose him instead, something broke in me. He reached for a cup of water, his hand shaking. After I found her, after I learned about you, I thought I could make amends. Give you everything, the Berkeley name, wealth, education. Keep Judith safe from Margaret. While keeping her from her own child, David pointed out, his voice tight. Margaret would have killed her if she'd come forward, Harold insisted. And what kind of life could Judith have given you then? A disabled single mother with no resources, no protection? He looked to Judith pleading. I told myself it was for the best. That someday when it was safe. But it was never going to be safe as long as Margaret lived, Judith finished for him. And by the time she died, too many years had passed. Too many lies had been told. Harold nodded wearily. The truth is, I was a coward. Too weak to stand. Against Margaret. Too selfish to give up the son I'd come to love as my own. His gaze moved from David to me. But you knew something wasn't right. From the moment you married into the family, you saw what we couldn't, or wouldn't. I thought about all the small inconsistencies that had always bothered me about the Berkeley family: Margaret's controlling nature, Harold's quiet resignation, the odd dynamics between David and his supposed parents. "What happens now?" David asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the air. Harold reached toward the bedside table. "In that drawer, there's an envelope. My lawyer has the originals." I retrieved the envelope and handed it to David, who opened it to find legal documents. "A revised will," Harold explained, "and documents acknowledging the truth about your parentage, about what happened to Judith, about Michael." He took a labored breath. "It won't make things right, but perhaps it can be a start." David scanned the papers, his expression unreadable. "You're dividing the estate, half to me, half to a trust for Judith." "The Berkeley fortune should have been hers," Harold said. "It's 40 years too late, but it's hers now. As for Charlotte," he hesitated, "there's provision for her legal defense and rehabilitation, if she'll accept it." "And the truth?" I asked. "Will that come out too?" Harold looked to Judith, then to David. "That's not for me to decide anymore. I've kept enough secrets for one lifetime." The weight of that decision hung in the air between mother and son. Two strangers connected by blood, but separated by decades of lies. Judith reached hesitantly toward David, not quite touching him. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "know that I never stopped looking for you. Every dark-haired boy I passed on the street, every young man with your build, I searched for traces of Michael, traces of myself." David looked down at her hand, then slowly, deliberately, took it in his own. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a beginning. And as I watched my husband meeting his mother for the first time in 40 years, I realized that Margaret's secret, revealed at her funeral, had set in motion not just the unraveling of a family built on lies, but perhaps eventually the creation of one built on truth. The week following Harold's confession passed in a blur of legal meetings, medical consultations, and emotional reckonings. David took a leave of absence from his company. Charlotte remained in police custody pending formal charges, and Judith stayed in a hotel near the hospital, unwilling to return to the Berkeley mansion where Margaret's presence still lingered. I moved between them all like a diplomat between warring nations, carrying messages, providing support, and trying to hold together the fragments of a family that had never truly existed in the first place. "The DA wants to know if we'll testify against Charlotte," I told David as we sat in our kitchen late one evening, untouched cups of tea growing cold between us. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "For attempting to murder her own father? God, Eleanor, how did we get here?" "You don't have to decide tonight," I said gently. "The doctors say Harold is still too weak for any formal statements anyway." David nodded absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. "I met with Judith today, at the hotel." This was news. For days, he'd been avoiding one-on-one meetings with his biological mother, processing Harold's revelations through long walks alone and late-night research into the Berkeley family history. "How was it?" I asked carefully. "Strange. Familiar." He looked up, his eyes troubled. "I keep expecting to feel something definitive. Anger at being kept from her, or resentment that she didn't find a way back to me. But when I'm with her, all I feel is this weird sense of recognition, like I've known her all my life." "You share DNA," I pointed out. "And from what I've seen, quite a few mannerisms, too." He almost smiled. "She taps her fingers when she's thinking. 3 quick taps, then a pause. I do that." "You do," I agreed, reaching across to cover his hand with mine. "What else did you talk about?" "The Berkeley Corporation, the legal implications of her resurrection." He shook his head. "The board is in panic mode. Stock is already down 12% since rumors started circulating about irregularities in the family succession. What does Judith want to do? That's just it, David said, surprise still evident in his voice. She doesn't want anything to do with the company. Says she left that life behind decades ago. She's built something completely different in Montreal, an art therapy program for trauma survivors. He laughed softly. Turns out she inherited our grandfather's business acumen after all. The program operates in 3 countries now. I smiled, remembering Judith's quiet dignity, her resourcefulness in building a new life from the ashes of the old. She's remarkable. She wants to meet with Harold, David continued, his expression darkening. Alone. Are you okay with that? He was silent for a long moment. I don't know if I'll ever be okay with any of this, Eleanor. The man raised me as his son while keeping me from my real mother, and he murdered my biological father. His voice broke slightly on the last words. But he's also dying. And despite everything, when I look at him in that hospital bed, he trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions. You still love him, I finished quietly. Is that wrong? After what he did? I considered this carefully. I think human emotions don't easily divide into right and wrong, David. You loved Harold as your father for 35 years. That doesn't disappear with one revelation, no matter how shocking. He nodded, some tension easing from his shoulders. The lawyers say I need to decide about the will, about whether to accept Harold's division of the estate. And have you decided? I don't want any of it, he said firmly. The Berkeley money has brought nothing but misery. It turned Margaret into a murderer, Harold into an accomplice, Charlotte into… He couldn't finish. I built my company from the ground up. We don't need blood money. What about Judith? She's the one who was truly robbed of her inheritance. She doesn't want it either, David revealed. Says money is what destroyed her family in the first place. I thought about the modest cottage on the coast, about Judith's simple clothes and unadorned lifestyle. So what will happen to the Berkeley fortune? David's expression shifted to something almost peaceful. We've been discussing a foundation for survivors of domestic violence, identity theft, fraud. The kinds of crimes that destroy lives like Judith's was destroyed. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. That sounds perfect. The following morning, I drove to the hospital for my scheduled visit with Harold. David had reluctantly returned to work for a few hours, needing the distraction of normalcy, and Judith's meeting was scheduled for later that afternoon. I found Harold sitting up in bed, looking marginally better than he had all week. The cancer was still killing him, but the immediate effects of Charlotte's poisoning were receding. Eleanor, he greeted me, his voice stronger than I expected. Always faithful in your visits. I set a small vase of fresh flowers on his bedside table, replacing the wilting ones from earlier in the week. How are you feeling today? Like a man running out of time, he answered honestly. But perhaps with enough left to do what needs to be done. I settled into the visitor's chair. David told me Judith is coming to see you today. Harold's hands tightened on the blanket. Yes, our first private conversation in nearly 20 years. This surprised me. You've met with her before? Recently? Not recently, no. But over the decades, occasionally. When Margaret traveled without me, I would sometimes visit the cottage, check on Judith. His eyes took on a faraway look. She never forgave me for keeping David from her. I don't blame her for that. Yet, she still accepted your support, the payments. What choice did she have? Harold asked simply. Disabled from the fall, identity erased, believed dead by the world. Margaret had made sure there was nowhere else for her to turn. I studied him, carefully. Did you ever consider telling David the truth? Once he was an adult? Harold's laugh was bitter. Every day. But by then, the lie had become the foundation of our entire lives. And Margaret. He shook his head. Margaret would have destroyed anyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. Even David. You were afraid of her, I realized. With good reason. I saw what she did to Judith, what she was capable of. He picked at a loose thread on the blanket. And there was Charlotte to consider. Margaret made sure Charlotte was dependent on her approval, her validation. If the truth had come out, Charlotte would have been devastated. Instead, she became just like her mother, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice, willing to poison her own father to protect her inheritance. Harold flinched. I failed her too, just as I failed everyone. Except David, I pointed out. Whatever. Your motives, however wrong your methods. You did give him a good life. Education, opportunity, love. Small comfort against the crime of separating him from his mother. Harold's eyes met mine directly. I know what you must think of me, Eleanor. The depths I sank to. Murdering Michael, conspiring with Margaret, keeping Judith away from her child for decades. There's no justification. Then why are you telling me this? I asked. Why not just take these secrets to your grave? Because I need someone to understand, he replied, a sudden urgency in his tone. Not to forgive, I don't deserve that, but to understand that I wasn't always this person, that I became this monster, one compromise at a time, one rationalization after another. I recognized the need for confession, for absolution before death, but I wasn't qualified to grant either. I'm not the one you need to explain this to, I said gently. No, he agreed, his gaze drifting toward the door. But you're the only one who might be willing to listen without judgment. David carries the burden of learning his entire life was built on lies. Judith carries 40 years of loss and betrayal. Only you stand slightly outside, seeing all sides. There was truth in that. My position as newcomer to the Berkeley drama had given me a unique perspective, connected enough to care deeply, removed enough to see the patterns. What will you say to Judith today? I asked. Harold's expression grew solemn. The truth. All of it. Even the parts she doesn't yet know. There's more? I couldn't keep the disbelief from my voice. After all the revelations of the past week, what else could possibly remain hidden? One last secret, Harold confirmed. One Margaret took to her grave, and one I've carried alone since the day I found Judith in that hospital. He closed his eyes briefly. It's why I called Judith after Margaret died. Why I was finally ready to bring her home. Not just because I'm dying, but because without Margaret's influence. He trailed off. What is it? I prompted. What final secret? Harold shook his head. It's for Judith to hear first. After that, it will be her choice whether to share it. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Berkeley, your medication. She approached with a small paper cup of pills, eyeing me apologetically. I'll need to check his vitals as well. I stood, recognizing my cue to leave. I'll come back tomorrow, Harold. He caught my hand as I turned to go. Eleanor, whatever happens after today, take care of them. David, Judith, they'll need you. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. Harold, you're not planning to... I'm planning to do what I should have done 40 years ago, he interrupted, his grip surprisingly strong. Tell the whole truth, and accept the consequences. As I left the hospital, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. I thought about Harold's words, about the weight of secrets and the devastation they caused. What final revelation? Could he be holding back? And what consequences was he prepared to face? My phone rang as I reached the car. David, asking me to meet him at the Berkeley Corporation headquarters downtown. What's going on? I asked, sensing tension in his voice. The board called an emergency meeting. Someone leaked information about... Judith being alive, about the inheritance complications. They're talking about forcing a sale of the company before the stock crashes completely. I'm on my way, I assured him, already starting the car. As I navigated traffic toward downtown, my mind kept returning to Harold's cryptic statements, to the burden of his final secret. Whatever it was, something told me it would change everything. Again. Again. The Berkeley Corporation headquarters occupied a gleaming glass tower downtown. Its logo, a stylized bee intertwined with what looked like a laurel wreath, displayed prominently on the facade. I'd been here only once before, when David had briefly considered joining the family business years ago. Margaret had given me a frosty tour, emphasizing at every turn that the Berkeley legacy was built on discerning taste and exclusive connections, qualities she'd clearly found lacking in her son's choice of wife. Now, as I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I wondered how much of that legacy was built on Judith's stolen birthright. I found David in a conference room, surrounded by gray-haired men in expensive suits whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed. Panic when he saw me, relief washed over his face. "Eleanor, thank you for coming." He introduced me quickly to the board members, most of whom barely acknowledged my presence, too absorbed in their crisis. "The reports are everywhere," a man named Thornton was saying, gesturing to a tablet displaying financial news headlines. Berkeley, heir allegedly murdered for fortune. Berkeley Corporation founded on crime? The stock has dropped 18% since opening. "We need a statement," another board member insisted. "Something to reassure investors that the company remains stable despite these family complications." David looked exhausted. "As I've explained, until we've resolved the legal questions surrounding my Aunt Judith's status and the legitimate succession of my grandfather's estate, I can't in good conscience make any such statement." "Your aunt?" Thornton repeated incredulously. "The woman was declared legally dead 40 years ago. This is clearly some sort of scam, someone taking advantage of your family during a vulnerable time." "Judith Berkeley is very much alive," I interrupted, unable to remain silent. "And DNA testing has already confirmed her identity, as well as her relationship to David." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. "Which means," I continued, meeting Thornton's gaze directly, "that everything you thought you knew about the Berkeley succession is in question, including who rightfully owns this company." "This is preposterous," Thornton sputtered. "Harold Berkeley has been running this company for decades. His leadership, along with Margaret's guidance on the charitable foundation, has made the Berkeley name synonymous with integrity and excellence." The irony was almost painful. "Mr. Thornton, I understand this is difficult to process, but the facts remain. Margaret Berkeley attempted to murder her sister to gain control of this company. She then stole her sister's child and built a life on that deception. If you're concerned about the Berkeley name and integrity, perhaps you should be asking different questions." David touched my arm gently, a warning not to go too far, or perhaps gratitude for saying what he couldn't. "Gentlemen," he addressed the board, "I suggest we adjourn until my lawyers have completed their review of the situation. In the meantime, I recommend against any public statements that might later prove inaccurate." The thinly veiled threat worked. The board members filed out, murmuring among themselves, leaving David and me alone in the conference room. "That was quite a performance," he said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." "Don't be." It was satisfying to watch Thornton squirm. He's been one of Margaret's biggest supporters for years. David loosened his tie, suddenly looking like a man desperate to escape. "Let's get out of here. I can't breathe in this building." We walked to a small park across from the tower, finding a bench beneath a maple tree. The day had turned beautiful, warm sunshine belying the emotional storm we were still navigating. "Harold has one more secret," I told David, recounting my morning conversation at the hospital. "Something he wants to tell Judith before anyone Else? David shook his head wearily. Of course he does. Why would I expect all the family skeletons to be revealed in one go? He implied it was significant, something Margaret took to her grave. Any guesses? I hesitated, then shared the thought that had been forming since leaving the hospital. What if Judith's fall wasn't as accidental as Harold has led everyone to believe? David stared at me. You think Harold was there? At the cliffs? I don't know. But he's been carrying guilt that seems disproportionate, even considering everything we already know. I took David's hand. Whatever it is, he wanted me to promise to take care of you and Judith afterward. That sounds ominous. It felt that way, I admitted. David checked his watch. Judith's meeting with him should be starting about now. He looked torn. Part of me wants to be there, to protect her from whatever this revelation is. The other part needs space to process everything you've already learned. I finished for him. He nodded, squeezing my hand gratefully. How are you so steady through all this, Eleanor? Your entire understanding of your in-laws has been upended, yet you keep moving forward, making decisions, holding us all together. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on supporting David, on uncovering the truth, that I'd barely examined my own feelings. I suppose, I said slowly, it's because even though I'm shocked by what Margaret and Harold did, I'm not surprised by who they were. There was always something off about them, about how they treated you, how they managed the family dynamics. I looked up at the Berkeley Tower looming over the park. This explains so much about the tension I felt from the moment I entered their world. David was silent for a long moment. I used to think it was my fault, he finally said. That I wasn't the son they wanted. That I'd disappointed them somehow. Margaret was so critical, so controlling, and Harold was just absent emotionally, even when he was physically present. It wasn't your fault, I said firmly. They were carrying the weight of their crimes, their deception, and projecting that onto you. And onto Charlotte, David added, his expression pained. God, Eleanor, did we miss signs that she was becoming like Margaret? Could we have prevented what happened? I thought about Charlotte's desperate actions, her belief that she was protecting the family legacy as Margaret had taught her. I don't think so. Charlotte made her choices, just as Margaret and Harold made theirs. My phone buzzed with a text from Judith. Finished meeting with Harold. Need to see you both immediately. Can you come to the hotel? I showed David the message. No details about what Harold told her? Let's go, he said, already standing. Whatever this final secret is, I want to hear it from her. Judith's hotel suite was modest but comfortable, with a small sitting area where she waited for us, her face pale but composed. She embraced David briefly when we arrived, a gesture he accepted with less awkwardness than I'd observed in their previous encounters. Thank you for coming, she said, gesturing for us to sit. I know you have questions about my meeting with Harold. Did he tell you the final secret he mentioned to Eleanor? David asked directly. Judith nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Yes, and now I understand why he waited until Margaret was gone to contact me, to bring me home. She took a deep breath. Harold wasn't just complicit in keeping us apart, David. He was present the day Margaret pushed me off that cliff. David went absolutely still. He watched her try to kill you? Not just watched, Judith corrected gently. He helped plan it. I gasped despite myself. Harold helped Margaret attempt to murder you? He was in love with her by then, Judith explained, her voice remarkably steady for someone describing her own attempted murder. Or perhaps more accurately, in love with what she offered, connection to the Berkeley fortune, status, power. Margaret had convinced him that with me gone, they could build something together. So he helped lure you to the cliffs, David said, the pieces falling into place. Then stood by while his future wife pushed you over. Judith's gaze was distant, remembering. He claims he didn't know exactly what she planned, that he thought, they were just going to threaten me, force me to sign over my inheritance. But when Margaret suddenly pushed me, she shook her head. He did nothing, watched me fall, left me for dead. And then spent the next 40 years paying for his crime, I murmured, understanding Harold's guilt in a new light. When he found me in that hospital months later, it was by accident, Judith continued. He was visiting a business associate and saw me being wheeled to physical therapy. I was still using my mother's maiden name, still unable to walk without assistance? Her voice hardened slightly. The look on his face, pure shock, then terror. He knew if I recovered fully, if I came forward, both he and Margaret would face attempted murder charges. So he offered you a deal, David concluded. Stay dead, and he would support you financially. It wasn't quite that simple, Judith said, surprising us both. Harold was genuinely remorseful, or at least he convinced me he was. He told me Margaret had received news she was pregnant, that they were married now. He begged me to think of the innocent child. David's face went ashen. Me. That's what I believed at the time, Judith confirmed. I agreed to stay away, to remain dead, to protect my sister's child from the scandal. It wasn't until years later that I began to suspect the truth, that Margaret had never been pregnant, that the baby she claimed was hers. Was actually yours, I finished softly. Judith nodded, tears finally breaking through her composed exterior. By then, Margaret had established herself as your mother. Harold controlled all access to you, and I was trapped in a new identity, dependent on their payments, my body still damaged from the fall. And then today, David prompted, Harold finally admitted the whole truth. Yes, Judith confirmed. Not just about his role in the attempted murder, but about something else. The reason he finally contacted me after Margaret died. She took a deep breath. Harold is dying, as you know, but before he goes, he's made a full confession to the authorities. What? David and I exclaimed simultaneously. He's confessed to his role in my attempted murder, to Michael's murder, to the fraud involving David's birth certificate. Everything. Judith's expression was complex, part vindication, part grief. The police are with him now, taking his formal statement. But the statute of limitations, I began, doesn't apply to attempted murder in this state, Judith finished, or to murder. Harold will be arrested as soon as he's medically stable enough to be transferred to the jail ward. David stood abruptly, pacing the small room. I don't even know what this is. The man I thought was my father is not only a murderer and an accomplice, but now he's choosing prison for whatever time he has left? He's choosing the truth, Judith corrected gently. Finally. Why now? I asked. After all these years of silence? Margaret's death freed him in more ways than one, Judith explained. Not just from her influence, but from his promise to her, that he would protect her reputation, her legacy, at all costs. And Charlotte? David asked. If Harold is confessing to everything, her involvement will likely be viewed differently in light of his statements, Judith acknowledged. Her lawyers are already positioning it as the result of psychological manipulation by both parents. Harold has apparently provided evidence supporting that interpretation. I thought about the Charlotte I'd known, tightly wound, desperate for approval, molded in Margaret's image. Perhaps there was truth to that defense after all. There's one more thing, Judith said, her voice softening. Something Harold wanted me to tell you, David. Something he couldn't say himself. David stopped pacing, bracing himself visibly. What is it? The night before Margaret died, when the morphine had her drifting between consciousness and delirium, Harold asked her directly, did she regret any of it? Taking your aunt's life, her fortune, her child? Judith's eyes held David steadily, and Margaret told him no. She regretted nothing except one thing: that despite all her efforts, you never became the Berkeley heir she wanted. That you had too much of Judith in you, too much integrity, too much independence. To my surprise, David laughed, a genuine if slightly broken sound. She's right about that. I never fit into the Berkeley mold. He looked at Judith with new understanding. I get that from you, it seems. So it would appear, she agreed, a small smile touching her lips. I watched them, these two strangers connected by blood, seeing the same strength, the same resilience in both their faces. Despite everything Margaret and Harold had done to keep them apart, some essential truth of their connection had survived. What happens now? I asked, the question that had been hanging between all of us since the funeral. Judith looked to David, giving him the space to decide. Now, he said firmly, we rebuild. Not the Berkeley legacy. That deserves to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. But something new, something honest. He reached for my hand, then hesitantly extended his other hand toward Judith. Something that honors the truth of who we really are. Judith took his offered hand, completing the circle between us. Outside the hotel window, the sun was setting on the Berkeley Tower, its glass facade reflecting gold and crimson light, beautiful and blinding, like the fortune that had destroyed so many lives. But here, in this quiet room, I felt something new taking root. A different kind of legacy, one built not on secrets and suffering, but on the hard-won wisdom that comes from finally facing the truth. Facing the truth. 6 months after Margaret Berkeley's funeral, I stood in the doorway of a small art therapy studio in Montreal, watching as Judith guided a group of trauma survivors through an exercise in expression through color. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple knot, her movements graceful despite the slight limp that remained from her fall 40 years ago. When she spotted me, her face brightened with a smile that was becoming wonderfully familiar. "Eleanor," she greeted me warmly after dismissing her class. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "I finished my meetings early," I explained, embracing her. "And I thought you might like company for your visit with Harold this afternoon." A shadow crossed her face briefly. "Thank you. I would." The drive to the prison medical facility took us through neighborhoods transitioning from autumn glory to winter starkness. Judith was quiet, watching the passing scenery with thoughtful eyes. "Are the visits getting any easier?" I asked gently. She considered this. "Not easier, exactly, but necessary." She turned to me. "For both of us, I think. We're trying to find, not forgiveness, perhaps, but understanding." I nodded, thinking of the remarkable journey of the past 6 months. Harold Berkeley, once respected businessman and family patriarch, was now inmate Darfur 58721, serving concurrent sentences for his roles in Michael Lawson's murder and Judith's attempted murder. His terminal cancer had progressed rapidly, prompting his transfer to the prison's medical wing, where doctors estimated he had weeks, perhaps days, remaining. "David sends his love," I told her. "He's sorry he couldn't make this trip." "The company transition is keeping him busy," Judith acknowledged without resentment. "How is it progressing?" "The employee buyout is almost complete. Once the Berkeley name is removed from the corporate documentation, the transfer of ownership can finalize." I smiled, thinking of David's dedication to ensuring the company workers didn't suffer for the family's crimes. "The foundation launches next month. We've already received applications from organizations across 3 states. The Berkeley Foundation for Truth and Reconciliation," Judith recited. "A fitting repurposing of that fortune." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The wealth that had driven Margaret to murder was now being used to heal victims of similar crimes. The announcement had generated significant media coverage, most of it positive, a welcome change from the scandal that had dominated headlines in the immediate aftermath of Harold's confession. At the prison facility, we underwent the now familiar security procedures before being escorted to the medical wing. Harold's room, while sparse, contained a few personal touches: a sketch David had drawn of the cottage at Gloucester, a small plant from Charlotte, a book of poetry I had brought on a previous visit. Harold himself was barely recognizable from the distinguished man I'd met at Margaret's funeral. Cancer had ravaged his body, leaving him gaunt and frail, his skin yellowed with jaundice. Yet his eyes, when they opened at our arrival, remained sharp and alert. "Judith," he greeted, his voice a dry whisper. "Eleanor. You came." "Of course we came," Judith replied, taking the chair nearest his bed. I settled on the other side, giving them some semblance of privacy while remaining present as support. "I spoke with Charlotte's lawyer yesterday," Harold said after a nurse had helped him with some water. "The plea agreement is finalized. 5 years, with eligibility for early release based on her continued psychiatric treatment and community service." The news wasn't surprising. Charlotte's cooperation with prosecutors, combined with evidence of Margaret's psychological manipulation, had resulted in a relatively lenient sentence for her attempt on Harold's life. "And how is she?" Judith asked, her capacity for compassion extending even to the daughter of the woman who had tried to kill her. "Better, I think. The therapy is helping her understand Margaret's influence." Harold's thin fingers plucked restlessly at his blanket. "She asked about you, about David. Wanted to know if you would consider visiting her before she begins her sentence next month." Judith and I exchanged glances. David had struggled most with Charlotte's betrayal, the sister he had grown up with choosing Margaret's twisted legacy over his welfare. He still couldn't bring himself to see her. "I'll visit," Judith said after a moment. "I can't speak for David, but perhaps in time." Harold nodded weakly. "Time is the one thing I can't offer him anymore." His gaze shifted to the ceiling. "The doctors say days now, maybe a week. Is there anything you need?" I asked, the question inadequate against the finality of his prognosis. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Just what you're already giving. Knowing that, despite everything, something good has emerged from our family's darkness." He looked at Judith. "You've seen the cottage?" "In the cottage?" "Yes," she confirmed. "Eleanor and David took me there last month. It's still as peaceful as I remember." What she didn't say was how the visit had affected her. Standing again on those cliffs, looking down at the rocks where she had nearly died, had moved something fundamental in her healing process. David had stood beside her, his arm supporting her, as she faced the physical location of her worst trauma. "I've signed the deed over to you," Harold said. "It should have been yours, all along." "Thank you," Judith replied simply. There was no need to elaborate on the inadequacy of the gesture against 40 years of lost life, lost connection with her son. But I had observed, over these months, how Judith consistently chose grace over bitterness, forward movement over recrimination. "And Margaret's portrait?" Harold asked, referring to the formal oil painting that had dominated the mansion's main staircase. "Removed," I told him. David donated the frame to a historical society. The canvas. I hesitated, then finished honestly. "We burned it, in the garden. It was something of a ceremony." Harold closed his eyes briefly. "Good." We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the beeping of medical equipment and Harold's labored breathing. Finally, he spoke again, his voice even fainter. "I've been thinking about redemption," he said, looking toward the small window with its view of bare tree branches against a gray sky. "Whether it's possible after certain lines are crossed." "What have you concluded?" Judith asked. "That it isn't something granted from outside," he replied. "Not absolution or forgiveness, which I have no right to ask for, but perhaps atonement. Doing what little good remains possible. I thought about Harold's full confession, his willingness to face justice even when he might have escaped it given his terminal condition, about his cooperation with prosecutors to minimize Charlotte's sentence while accepting full responsibility for his own crimes, about the revised will that had directed the Berkeley fortune toward healing and reconciliation rather than maintaining a corrupt legacy. The foundation will help many people, I offered. That's something. Harold nodded slightly. And David? How is he truly? This was the question that always came, in every visit, asked with a father's concern despite the biological truth we all now knew. He's finding his way, I said honestly. Working through the complex emotions of learning his entire identity was built on lies, but also discovering parts of himself that finally make sense. His artistic talent, Judith added. His intuitive understanding of trauma and healing. These were always mysteries to Margaret, who couldn't understand where they came from. They came from you, Harold acknowledged, and from Michael. The truth was always there, visible in David himself, if we had only been brave enough to see. Another silence fell, this one more comfortable than the last. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, dusting the prison yard with white. I have a request, Harold said finally. One last one. What is it? Judith asked. When I'm gone. He paused, gathering strength. I don't want a funeral like Margaret's. No pretense, no performances. Just let me go quietly. Is there anywhere specific you'd like your ashes placed? I asked, practical even in this difficult conversation. Harold considered this. There's a meadow behind the cottage at Gloucester. In spring, it's full of wildflowers. Michael used to sketch there sometimes. His eyes met Judith's. Would that be too painful for you? She shook her head. No, Harold. I think that would be appropriate. A nurse appeared, signaling the end of visiting hours. As we prepared to leave, Harold reached for both our hands. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing me through to the end, for allowing David to know the truth, however painful, and for building something meaningful from our family's wreckage. 3 days later, the call came from the prison chaplain. Harold Berkeley had died peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy far more complex than the respectable businessman the world had once known. David received the news with quiet solemnity, neither celebrating nor grieving in conventional ways. I feel like I've been mourning him since the day of Mother's funeral, he admitted as we prepared for bed that night. Not just his impending death, but the death of who I thought he was. Who was he to you, in the end? I asked softly. David considered this, his expression thoughtful. A flawed man who made catastrophic choices out of weakness, fear, and misguided love, who spent decades trying to protect a lie because he couldn't face the consequences of the truth. He sighed. And also the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every science fair even when Margaret couldn't be bothered. I nodded, understanding the complexity of his emotions. Both things can be true. That's what I'm learning, David agreed, that people aren't simply heroes or villains, that good and evil can exist in the same heart. A month later, on a crisp winter morning, we gathered at the cottage at Gloucester, David, Judith, myself, and a few others who had been part of our journey. Charlotte was notably absent, having begun serving her sentence the previous week, but she had sent a simple arrangement of white roses for the occasion. The meadow behind the cottage was dormant now, waiting for spring's renewal, but there was beauty in its winter sleep, in the promise of wildflowers that would emerge after the thaw. As David scattered Harold's ashes across the frozen ground, Judith stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. No words were spoken. No eulogies, no readings, no attempts to summarize or justify a life marked by both profound love and devastating betrayal. just the whisper of ashes returning to earth, and the quiet solidarity of a family finding its way back to truth. Later, as David and Judith walked the perimeter of the meadow deep in conversation, I remained on the cottage porch, watching them, mother and son, separated for 4 decades, slowly building a relationship that honored both their biological connection and the reality of their time apart. My phone buzzed with a text from the foundation director, asking about the final details for the launch event next week. As I responded, I realized how far we had all come since that rainy day at Margaret's funeral, when Harold had first pulled me aside to reveal a secret that would change everything. The Berkeley family fortune, built on lies and secured through murder, was now being redirected toward healing and justice. The cottage, once a prison for Judith's identity, had become a place of reconciliation. And David, raised as the heir to a corrupt legacy, was now creating something entirely new. A future based on honesty, compassion, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing painful truths. When they returned from their walk, I saw something different in both their faces, a lightness, a sense of possibility. "We've been talking," David said, taking my hand as the 3 of us stood together on the porch, "about expanding the foundation's work to include an arts therapy program, using Judith's expertise to help trauma survivors reclaim their stories through creative expression." "It feels right," Judith added, her eyes bright despite the cold. "Using what I've learned through my own healing to help others find their way back." I smiled, sensing the rightness of this new direction. A legacy worth building. As we prepared to leave the cottage, David paused in the doorway, looking back at the meadow where we had scattered Harold's ashes. "Do you think redemption is possible?" "After death?" he asked, echoing Harold's final question. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I think what matters more is what the living do with the truths they've inherited." Judith nodded, her gaze following David's. "The past can't be changed, but its meaning can be transformed by how we carry it forward." Together we closed the cottage door and turned toward the future. Not the future Margaret Berkeley had envisioned, built on privilege and secrets, but one forged in the painful fire of revelation, tempered by compassion, and ultimately stronger for having embraced the truth, however difficult it had been to bear. As we drove away from Gloucester, the cottage growing smaller in the rearview mirror, I thought about how families are built not just through blood or legal ties, but through the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Margaret's story had been one of ambition, entitlement, and ruthless preservation of appearances. Harold's had been one of moral compromise and decades of silent atonement. But the story we were writing now was different, messy and imperfect, but authentic. A story of reclamation and renewal, of finding meaning beyond tragedy, of choosing truth over comfort. A story worthy of the journey we had all undertaken since that rainy afternoon when my father-in-law had revealed his secret at the funeral, setting in motion a reckoning that none of us could have anticipated, but which had ultimately set us free.